The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was, Violet thought, a particularly cruel day for one's life to be dismantled. She had been in the kitchen of the Dunmore house. Not her kitchen, not anymore, though she had grown up watching cook roll pastry on that same flour-whitened table. When the solicitor's boy knocked at the servant's entrance and asked for a Miss Violet Ashcroft. Not Lady Violet. Not Miss Ashcroft of Wingate. Just Miss Violet Ashcroft, as though she were already nobody, and the paperwork had simply caught up. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it into quarters and put it in her apron pocket and went back to peeling the carrots, because there were 12 people except Spiffot for supper this fourth sarser, and the carrots still needed peeling, and sometimes the body simply continues while the mind works out whether it is ruined. She was, as it turned out, quite thoroughly ruined. Her father had died in October. She had known that much. She had been at the funeral, standing to one side while her cousin Reginald. She caught herself. While her father's nephew stood at the graveside with the expression of a man already measuring rooms. She had not liked him when she was a child. She did not like him now. He had her father's eyes but none of her father's warmth, and he wore both as though they were items of clothing he'd inherited along with the estate. The letter confirmed it. Wingate had passed to the male line, as estates do, and Reginald Dunmore Ashcroft had taken possession in November. He had been generous enough, the solicitor noted, generous enough, to offer Violet a position in the household. She could stay on, as a housemaid, in the house where she had been born. She had said no. Obviously, she had said no. She had packed her 2 good dresses and her mother's brooch and the small watercolor of the South Garden that nobody had ever thought worth cataloging, and she had left. That had been 4 months ago. She was, she told herself, not bitter. She was practical. She had learned to be practical the way one learns to walk after a bad fall, carefully, with attention to where the ground actually was, rather than where one expected it to be. The practical thing now was the position at Thornfield Hall. Not Thornfield. She corrected herself as she studied the advertisement in Mrs. Patton's sitting room. She had rented a room from Mrs. Patton for 3 months, and the woman was kind, but her sitting room smelled permanently of cabbage. Harrow Park. The seat of the Duke of Ashmore. Under housemaid wanted. Experience preferred but not required. References to be submitted by the 14th. She had written 2 references herself, which was dishonest, and she had lost sleep over it. And she had sent them anyway, because the alternative was continuing to smell of cabbage, and she had a limit. The interview was on a Wednesday. She took the post coach north and arrived with mud on her boots and a blister on her right heel and was shown into the housekeeper's sitting room by a footman, who looked at her luggage, 1 bag, sensible, with an expression that suggested he had formed no strong opinions either way. The housekeeper was a Mrs. Fenwick. No, Violet stopped. She would not use that name. The woman before her was stout and sharp-eyed and introduced herself as Mrs. Aldbridge. She wore her keys on a chatelaine at her hip, and she looked at Violet the way experienced women look at young women who are trying to appear as something they are not, with perfect, patient neutrality. "You've worked in a large house before," Mrs. Aldbridge said. It was not quite a question. "I have," Violet said. This was, in the strictest sense, true. She had lived in a large house. She had watched the maids work. She had occasionally, when bored and her governess was otherwise occupied, followed them about and asked questions. She was choosing to count this. Mrs. Aldbridge looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "You'll do," and that was that. Harrow Park was larger than Wingate. Violet had not thought anything would be larger than Wingate, which had 42 rooms and a folly her great-grandfather had built during a period of, as her father diplomatically described it, romantic enthusiasm. Harrow Park had 59 rooms, a formal garden, an orangery, a lake, and a reputation. The reputation was, the Duke of Ashmore had returned from the continent 8 months ago, was conducting his affairs from Harrow Park rather than London, and was, depending on who one asked, either gravely ill, profoundly melancholy, or simply rude. The undermaids believed the first. Mrs. Aldbridge's expression, when anyone raised the subject, suggested the third. Violet kept her head down. This was easier than she had expected, because in the 4 months since leaving Windgate she had become, without quite deciding to, very good at being unnoticed. She had learned that if you moved with purpose and did not make eye contact and held a duster or a coal scuttle or a stack of pressed linens, people looked through you like a window. It was, she thought, a useful thing to know. She was not certain it was a comfortable thing to know. She shared a room with 2 other undermaids, a girl called Agnes and a girl called Bess, both younger than Violet, and both possessed of the cheerful practicality of people who had never expected anything different. Agnes knew everything about everyone in the house. Bess could sleep through anything. Violet liked them both more than she had expected to. The Duke, Agnes explained on Violet's 3rd evening, was not to be disturbed in the library after 9. He took his meals alone except on Sundays, when he took them alone in a different room. He was not unkind to the staff, Agnes said, with the particular emphasis of someone who knows this is the highest possible praise. He simply was not there, in the way that large silent things are not there, like weather, or the north wing, which nobody used. Violet nodded and said nothing, and filed this information away with the rest of it. She saw him first on a Friday 11 days into her employment, when she was carrying a basket of kindling to the upstairs corridor, and misjudged the corner near the portrait gallery, and walked directly into him. The kindling went everywhere. She had a half-second to take in height, dark coat, a face she had no time to properly examine, before she was crouching and gathering wood and saying, very quickly, "I beg your pardon, Your Grace, I wasn't attending. Leave it." His voice was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something harder, perhaps, or more irritated. It was just a voice. Even, not unkind, "I'll send someone." "It's no trouble, Your Grace. You'll be late with the fires." He stepped around her. She watched his boots because she was still crouching, and that was what was in her sightline. Good boots. Someone polished them carefully. "Leave it," he said again, and was gone. She left it. She was, as he had predicted, already late with the fires. Later, reassembling this moment for no audience but herself, she thought, he had looked at her, not through her, the way people looked at maids. At the uniform, the function, the moving piece of furniture. He had looked at her, briefly and without particular expression, and then he had moved on. It was probably nothing. She was probably reading significance into a 6-second interaction, because she had been lonely for 4 months, and her life had come apart at a seam. She hadn't known was there. Probably. She did not seek him out. She was not the kind of woman who did things like that, and also she had been raised by a man who believed deeply in the dignity of minding one's own business. But Harrow Park was a large house, and she was learning its rhythms, and sometimes rhythms overlap. She began to notice, for instance, that the Duke walked the east corridor between 11 and midnight, when he could not sleep, which Agnes confirmed was often. She noticed that he marked his place in books with whatever came to hand, a folded letter, a piece of thread, once an extraordinarily nice handkerchief, and that he never seemed to retrieve the markers, so that the library was slowly filling with orphaned placeholders. She noticed that he took his coffee without sugar, and his correspondence without assistance, and that he had, in the north-facing study, a collection of botanical prints that someone had catalogued incorrectly, which she found quietly maddening every time she dusted. She said nothing about the prints. She was a housemaid. The trouble began, as trouble often does, with something small. She had been at Harrow Park for 6 weeks when her cousin arrived. She had not known he was coming. There was no reason she should have known. She was not a member of the household who received advance notice of guests. She was the person who turned down the guest room beds and made sure the decanters were filled. She was carrying a vase of late hothouse flowers to the blue guest room when she heard his voice in the entrance hall below. She stopped. The vase was heavier than she remembered. She stood very still on the landing and listened to Reginald Dunmore Ashcroft explain to the footman that he was expected, that he and the Duke had corresponded regarding some matter of the County Land Association, that he would require his usual room. His usual room. She turned around very quietly and went back the way she had come and stood in the linen corridor for a moment, with her back against the wall, and the vase of flowers cold against her hands, and thought, of course he would know the Duke. Reginald knew everyone. He collected useful acquaintances the way other men collected debts, systematically, with an eye toward future leverage. She thought, he will not recognize me. She had changed her name. Ashcroft was her mother's family name, and Violet was her middle name, and she had become Violet Ashcroft with very little ceremony and some paperwork she preferred not to think about. She wore the uniform. She wore her hair differently. She was a housemaid at a house Reginald visited. She was furniture. She repeated this to herself several times. It helped moderately. She avoided the East Wing for 2 days, which required considerable rearrangement of her duties, and Mrs. Aldbridge gave her one long measuring look but said nothing. On the 3rd day she turned a corner and found herself face to face with her cousin in the morning room doorway, and there was no corridor to retreat into and no linen basket to hide behind, and she looked at him and he looked at her. And, "Pardon me," he said, and stepped around her, and was gone. She stood for a moment. Then she took a breath. Then she went to polish the silver, which she found, unlike almost everything else in her current life, to be a task that responded straightforwardly to effort. He had not recognized her. Of course he had not. She was furniture. It should have been a relief. She told herself it was a relief. She was aware, examining this feeling carefully, and honestly as her father had taught her, that it was not entirely a relief. It was also something else, something small and cold that sat at the base of her throat and did not have a clean name. She was dusting the incorrectly catalogued botanical prints on a gray Thursday afternoon when the Duke walked in. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. This had the quality of a conversation neither of them had begun. "I didn't know anyone was in here," he said. "I apologize, Your Grace. I can come back." "No." He crossed to his desk and sat down and opened a folder of correspondence with the air of a man taking up a familiar burden. "It doesn't matter." She went back to dusting. The clock on the mantel counted their silence in small, careful increments. "Those are catalogued wrong," she said. She had not intended to say it. She said it anyway, because 4 weeks of knowing it had apparently reached some kind of internal limit. He looked up. "What? The prince?" She gestured carefully at the second panel. "This one is labeled Helleborus niger, but the illustration is clearly H. Orientalis. You can tell by the leaf margin and the number of petals. Someone has transposed them. It probably doesn't matter," she added, because his expression had gone very still. "I only noticed because I used to know this family." She had nearly said my father had a set in his study. She had caught it in time, she thought. The Duke was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. Not suspicion. Something more careful than that. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "I read," she said, which was true, and also one of the least complete sentences she had ever spoken. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at his correspondence. "Fix it," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "The labels. Fix them. If you know which is which." She fixed them. She was aware, for the remainder of that afternoon, of him not quite looking at her, of the studied neutrality of a man who is paying careful attention to something he is pretending not to be paying attention to. She did not know what to do with this. She put it in the same mental drawer as everything else she did not currently know what to do with, and closed the drawer and got on. The complication, the one she had not planned for, could not have planned for, arrived on a Sunday. There was a dinner, 6 guests, 3 of the county's minor gentry, their wives, and Reginald, who had extended his visit by a week on the grounds of county business that everyone, including Reginald, understood to be social ambition. Violet had been assigned to assist in the dining room, which she had managed to do without incident or recognition for the first 4 courses. During the 5th course, she was refilling the water glasses at the far end of the table when she heard Reginald say, with the particular carrying confidence of a man who has never had cause to lower his voice, "The Ashcroft girl. Yes, tragic business. Father died without a male heir, estate reverted. Perfectly straightforward in law, though I understand she took it rather hard. Young women do." She did not spill the water. She would like credit for this, though there was no one to give it to her. "What became of her?" one of the wives asked. The curiosity of it was comfortable, the way people are curious about disasters that have not happened to them. "No idea," Reginald said pleasantly. "She refused quite reasonable terms, as I understand it. I offered to keep her on at Wingate in some capacity, very generous I thought under the circumstances, but she simply vanished. Quite dramatic. Quite dramatic. She had packed 2 dresses and her mother's brooch and left a house she could no longer afford to be in. She had been practical. She had been so determinedly, exhaustingly practical. She moved to the next glass. She did not look at Reginald. She did not look at the Duke, which was harder, because she was aware, without looking, that the Duke had gone very still at the head of the table. She completed the 5th course and the 6th course, and then she went to the kitchen and stood by the open scullery door in the cold air for 4 minutes precisely, which was how long she permitted herself, and then she went back. The guests retired at 11:30. Violet was stacking plates with Agnes when Mrs. Aldridge appeared in the doorway and said, without particular expression, that the Duke would like to see her in the study. Violet's hands were still for a moment. Then she set down the plates carefully and untied her apron. The study was lit by the fire and 2 lamps. The Duke was standing at the window rather than sitting at his desk, which struck her as significant without her being able to say why. "Close the door," he said. She did. "What is your name?" he said. "Your full name." She could lie. She could say Violet Ashcroft, and it would be true. It was her name now, or as much a name as anything. But she had been standing at that dinner table listening to her cousin describe her disappearance as dramatic, and she was tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the hours or the work, and she looked at the Duke of Ashmore standing at his window and thought, "This man noticed that I knew hellebores." "Violet Dunmore Ashcroft," she said, "Lady Violet, as it was, not as it is." He was quiet for a moment. He turned from the window. "You were at my dinner table tonight," he said. "I was serving at your dinner table." "You heard what your cousin said." "I am aware that I heard it, yes." He studied her. His expression was not pitying, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. It was something more like calculation, the careful attention of a man who is working something out. "Why are you here?" he said. "You could have found employment in London, more anonymity in the city." It was, she thought, exactly the right question. She had asked it herself at 2 in the morning more than once. "Wingate borders your southern estate," she said, "and there were some things there are some records, documents my father kept. I had reason to believe they might have some bearing on the terms of the entail." She stopped. "I am not a solicitor. I don't know if I'm right. But I needed to be close enough to find out, and I needed employment, and this was what was available." The Duke was very still. Your father kept records about the Ashmore estate? About the land boundary. There was a survey in 1847 that I believe was never correctly registered. My father mentioned it once, just once, and I have been trying to remember everything he said about it ever since October. She had said more than she intended. She seemed to be doing that, in this house, in this room, with this man who looked at her when she expected to be looked through. He crossed to the desk and sat down. He did not look like a man who was performing consideration. He looked like a man who was actually considering. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Tell me," he said, "what you remember." She told him. She told him about the survey and her father's offhand mention of it, and the letter she had found among his papers before the estate passed, the one she had taken because she believed, still believed, without certainty, that it mattered. She produced it from her pocket. She had carried it for 4 months. The fold lines were soft with handling. He read it twice. She watched his face. "Where did you get this?" he said. "It was my father's. I kept it when the estate was catalogued. No one noticed." She paused. "I was very useful furniture." Something moved across his face that was almost, not quite, a smile. "You were not furniture," he said. "I noticed you on your 3rd day." This was unexpected. She absorbed it carefully. "The corner near the portrait gallery," he said. "You dropped the kindling and apologized for a situation I'd equally caused. And then you sorted your priorities and left the kindling and went to do your job. I thought you had forgotten that." "I have a reasonable memory," he said, "when I choose to use it." He looked at the letter again. Then he set it down and looked at her, directly, the way he had in the corridor. Not through, not past, but at. "If this is what you believe it is," he said, "it would complicate matters considerably. For your cousin." "Yes, and you came here alone, with a falsified reference, and have been doing the work of a housemaid for 6 weeks, on the basis of a letter you aren't certain is significant, because it was the only idea you had." She considered this. "It sounds worse when you say it directly," she said. "It sounds," he said slowly, "like someone who was not going to simply vanish." Reginald had used the word. She heard it differently now. "No," she said, "I wasn't." He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. Outside, the November wind moved through the old oaks that lined the drive, and she could hear them the way she had always heard trees at night. Not as threat, but as company, the sound of other living things going about their business in the dark. "I will need to speak with my solicitor," the Duke said finally. "The survey, if it was never registered correctly, there is a process. It will take time, and it will require your cousin to answer some questions he may not wish to answer." Her heart was doing something complicated. She kept her face even. Her father had valued equanimity. She had not always understood why until she'd needed it. "And in the interim," she said. He looked at her steadily. "In the interim, I have had a housekeeper leave me for her daughter's household in Edinburgh, and Mrs. Aldridge is managing more than she should, and I am in considerable need of someone who can catalog a library correctly." He paused. "You seem to know plants. I know other things as well." "I imagine you do," he said. It wasn't a limitation. She looked at him. He looked at her. The clock on the mantel kept its quiet count. "I should tell you," she said, because she had come this far on honesty, or something near it, "that I am not certain the letter is enough. I have reason to believe it, but I may be wrong. You should know that before you involve your solicitor." "I know," he said. "I'm involving him anyway." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because your father kept records and your cousin did not mention them, and that is interesting. And because," he stopped. He seemed to be deciding something. "Because I read people somewhat better than I read botanical prints, and I know the difference between someone who is deceiving and someone who is surviving." She had not cried in 4 months. She had been practical. She had peeled carrots and polished silver and dusted the wrong labels off botanical prints, and she had not cried because there had been no time and no privacy and no point. She did not cry now, but it was, she thought, closer than it had been. "Thank you," she said. It was not enough. It was all she had. He nodded once, as though she had said something entirely ordinary. "There's a guest room in the south wing. Tell Mrs. Aldridge I've said so." He picked up his pen. "We'll speak again when I've heard from Edinburgh." She stood. She was at the door when he spoke again. "Lady Violet." She turned. He was looking at his desk. Not at her, at his desk, at the paper before him, in the way of someone who has decided to say something and is committing to it without looking up. "Windgate is a good estate," he said. "Your father managed it well, I've heard it said." "He did," she said. "It should have been yours." She stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold of the corridor at her back and the warmth of the room before her. "Yes," she said, "it should have." She went to find Mrs. Aldridge. The solicitor arrived from Edinburgh 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday. Violet had begun to feel that Tuesdays were, perhaps, not as uniformly terrible as she'd initially assessed. He was a small, neat man named Mr. Carlyle, who asked very precise questions and took very precise notes and spent 2 days reviewing documents that the Duke had apparently been gathering for some time. On the 3rd day, he asked to speak with Violet. She sat across from him in the Duke's study. The Duke was present, at the window, and answered every question precisely and clearly and without embellishment, because her father had also believed in precision, and she had learned more from him than she'd had occasion to use. Mr. Carlyle asked about the survey. He asked about the letter. He asked about the date of it and the name on it, and the nature of her father's relationship with the previous surveyor, who had died in 1861, and therefore could not be asked. Then he looked at his notes for a long moment. "The survey," he said, "was filed. It was, however, filed incorrectly, under a boundary designation that predated the 1843 redistricting. It has sat for 30 years in a registry file that no one has opened because the numbering system changed and it was never cross-referenced." He looked up. "Your father knew this. I believe he intended to raise it when the question of inheritance became relevant. He did not live to do so." The room was very quiet. "What does that mean?" she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of this. Mr. Carlyle looked at his notes again, though she suspected he knew what they said. "It means," he said, "that the terms of the entail as executed were based on a boundary assumption that is not, strictly speaking, accurate. The land, in its correctly surveyed form, does not meet the threshold required for automatic reversion to the male line." He paused. "In plain terms, the estate should not, by law, have passed to your cousin. The question of remedy will require some additional process, but—" He glanced at the Duke, who was still at the window, very still. "I believe we have grounds." Violet looked at her hands. They were in her lap. She had not realized she had placed them there. Reginald was in the house. He was, at this moment, in the blue guest room, because he had extended his visit again, because he was, she understood now, a man who stayed close to things he wanted to believe were settled. The Duke spoke from the window. "You'll begin the process." "Yes, Your Grace, and Dunmore Ashcroft will be notified." "That is the procedure, yes." The Duke turned from the window. He looked at Violet briefly, once. Not long enough for anyone to remark on it, long enough for her to see that he had made some decision of his own before any of this had been formally concluded. "Good," he said, and that was all. The notification went to Reginald that afternoon. She was not present for his reaction. She heard about it from Agnes, who heard about it from the second footman, who had apparently been carrying a salver nearby. Reginald had gone very white and then asked for a brandy and then said, in a voice that carried, that it was all quite irregular and he intended to contest it. He could, Mr. Carlyle had told her privately, try. The process would take time either way. He did not think Reginald would succeed. She was in the garden when Reginald found her, Or rather, when he came out into the December cold and saw her there, because she had not been hiding. She had been looking at the dormant roses, which were bare and architecturally interesting and smelled of cold earth, and she had been thinking about Windgate's south garden and whether the roses there were someone's responsibility now or nobody's. Reginald stopped when he saw her. She watched him remember. It took a moment. She saw the exact instant when the face resolved into something he knew. "Violet," he said. "Reginald," she said. He stared at her for a long moment. His expression moved through several things she did not particularly need to catalog. "You've been here," he said. "The whole time. 6 weeks," she said. "Give or take. You planned this." She considered this. "I had a letter," she said, "and I needed a position. The planning was somewhat." She searched for the word organic. He was quiet for a moment. He was, she thought, not quite as stupid as she sometimes allowed herself to believe, because his expression settled into something that recognized the situation rather than fighting it. "Father would have told you about the survey," he said. "He mentioned it once. I paid attention. He always said you paid attention." This was unexpected. She did not know what to do with it, so she looked at the dormant roses instead. "The estate is rightfully yours," he said, finally. It cost him something. She could hear it. "I won't pretend otherwise. I would have in different circumstances. But I won't now." She looked at him. She thought about 4 months of carrots and cabbage and silver polish and botanical prints. She thought about her father. She thought about a man at a window who had said, "Your father managed it well. It should have been yours." "Thank you," she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not forgiveness. It was the truth, which was that she was too tired for anything other than what was actually there. He nodded once and went back inside, and she stayed in the cold garden with the roses until she was ready to go in as well. The Duke found her in the library the following evening, which was not an accident on either of their parts, though neither of them said so. She was attempting to correctly catalog the botanical prints. There were more errors than she'd initially found, which was both aggravating and satisfying in approximately equal measure. He sat at his desk. He did not pretend to be doing correspondence. "Mr. Carlyle thinks 8 months," he said, "for the process. Possibly longer." "I know," she said. "He told me. You're welcome to stay here, in the south wing room, while it resolves." She turned a print over in her hands. H. Photitus correctly labeled. Someone had gotten some of them right. "That is a very long time to be a guest," she said. "You would not be a guest." He was quiet for a moment. "I mentioned the library. You mentioned I knew plants. You know rather more than plants." She set the print down carefully. She turned. He was looking at her with the same expression she had first noticed in the portrait gallery corridor, and then in the study, and then at dinner, and then, once, briefly, across a room full of people who were not paying attention. 8 months is a long time," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Things might become complicated." "They might," he said. "I find I'm not particularly concerned about that." She looked at him. She thought about her father who had believed in paying attention. She thought about a house she was going to get back. She thought about this house, which was cold and large, and full of incorrectly labeled things that were quietly waiting to be corrected, and a man who had noticed her on her 3rd day. "All right," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was the beginning of a sentence, and she thought, looking at him, that they both understood there was more to follow, that they had time, now, and something close to solid ground, and the rest could be worked out as they went. Outside, the December wind moved through the oaks. She could hear them the same as always, not threat, just company, just other living things, going on.